The scaffolding threw long shadows across Main Street Station as the lunch bell rang out over Richmond's East End. Evelyn Cross stood at the edge of the platform, watching Daniel Hartley split a sandwich in half for his daughter, laughing at something only the two of them understood. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Wish I had a happy family like yours." Daniel looked up, sawdust on his forearms, and answered before he could think better of it. "My kid needs a mom." Neither of them laughed. The wind carried the silence between them. Before we go any further, where do you think this story is headed? Leave your guess in the comments, then come back and see if you called it. Main Street Station had stood empty for 11 years before Cross and Wren bought it, gutted by 2 fires and a decade of neglect, and Daniel Hartley had spent the last 4 months trying to save what was left of it. He worked the way most people in Richmond remembered their grandfathers working, quiet, unhurried, hands that knew exactly where to go before his eyes did. He didn't use a level half as often as the other carpenters did. He didn't need to. Nobody on the crew asked him much about where he'd learned that. He liked it that way. Lily showed up most afternoons straight from Chimborazo Elementary, backpack still on, sneakers scuffed from the 6-block walk over. She'd find her father under whatever section of scaffolding he was working that day and settle onto a folded tarp, sometimes doing homework, sometimes not, always watching him. It was the same routine they'd had since she was 5, back when her mother's illness first made afternoons unpredictable, and it had simply never stopped. 9 years old now, and she still thought her father could fix anything, because as far as she'd seen, he always had. Evelyn watched them from the mezzanine more often than she meant to. She told herself it was a site inspection. It rarely was. There was something about the way Daniel crouched down to meet Lily's eyes when she talked, the way he never once glanced at his phone mid-sentence, that undid something in Evelyn she didn't have a name for. She had a corner office on Carey Street, with her name on the glass, and had eaten dinner alone at her desk 4 nights that week, takeout containers stacking up in a wastebasket nobody else saw. Richard Voss found her there one afternoon, arms folded, studying the platform the way a man studies a ledger he doesn't like the sum of. He'd been chairman of the board since before Evelyn was born, had been her father's closest friend for 30 years, and he still called her kiddo in meetings when he wanted something. "Bradley Kern is flying in Thursday," he said, without preamble. "His father wants this settled before the shareholders vote in the spring." "I haven't agreed to anything, Richard. Your father would have." She didn't answer that. She never did, because he was usually right about her father. And being right about her father was the thing Voss weaponized best. She walked the length of the platform after he left, past the paint tarps and pallets of reclaimed brick, until she found herself standing near Daniel's workbench without entirely deciding to. He didn't look up right away. When he did, he wiped his hands on a rag and waited, the way he waited for everything, like time cost him nothing at all. "You're staring at my joinery, or you're staring at me," he said. "Hard to tell which insults me more." It was the first time she'd laughed all week, and it surprised her how easily it came. They talked for 11 minutes that afternoon about nothing in particular, the grain of the reclaimed oak, whether the old ticket window should stay exposed brick or get paneled over, whether Lily's math homework counted as cruelty. Somewhere in those 11 minutes, Evelyn Cross forgot, briefly, that she was the CEO of a company worth crossing an ocean over. She was just a woman talking to a man who built things with his hands and didn't want anything from her. Lily wandered over halfway through, holding out a worksheet covered in fractions. "Do you know math?" she asked Evelyn, without any preamble of her own, a trait she'd clearly inherited. "I run a company. I'm required to." Lily considered that answer with the gravity of a judge and handed over the worksheet. Evelyn crouched down beside her on the tarp, and for the next 10 minutes the three of them worked through fractions together, Daniel occasionally correcting Evelyn's explanations with a dry half-smile until Lily declared herself finished and went back to drawing on the back page instead. Evelyn found reasons to walk the platform most afternoons after that, and Daniel, for his part, stopped pretending he didn't notice her coming. He showed her the parts of the building most visitors never saw. The old baggage tunnels beneath the main hall, the hand-carved rosettes on the ceiling someone a century ago had bothered to make beautiful, even though nobody would ever look at them closely. He talked about the building the way some men talked about boats or old cars, not with sentiment exactly, but with a kind of respect that assumed things built well deserved to be treated well. "You could have let this place get torn down," she said one afternoon. standing beneath a section of restored plasterwork. Would have been cheaper. Cheaper isn't the same as right. He ran a thumb along a seam in the plaster, checking it out of habit. Some things are worth the extra effort just because they were worth building in the first place. Doesn't have to make sense on a spreadsheet. She thought about that longer than she meant to. On the drive home, in the shower, lying awake later than she should have. It wasn't a line meant to mean anything beyond the building, she was fairly sure of that, and yet it sat in her chest like it had been meant for her anyway. The trouble started with a beam. The structural engineers Cross and Wren had subcontracted flagged a load calculation on the west mezzanine that didn't reconcile. A discrepancy buried in decades-old blueprints nobody could account for. 3 engineers spent 2 days arguing over it in the site trailer. Papers spread across the folding table, coffee going cold, until one of them finally threw up his hands and said the renovation might need to be delayed a month while they brought in a specialist from Baltimore. Daniel came by that evening to drop off a set of keys and found the blueprints still spread across the table, abandoned, everyone gone home frustrated. He stood over them for a long moment, then picked up a pencil, not trying to be seen, assuming the trailer was empty. Evelyn had come back for her laptop charger and stopped in the doorway, watching him work through the numbers with a speed that had nothing to do with carpentry. He wrote in the margins, small, precise, circling the exact load-bearing error the engineers had missed. Then the correction beside it, then a second correction accounting for a settling pattern nobody else had noticed at all. "You've done this before," she said. He set the pencil down like he'd been caught at something. "A long time ago." She picked up the blueprint. The math wasn't guesswork. It was fluent, the kind of fluency that came from years, not instinct, the kind you didn't get from watching contractors work. That night, alone at her desk, she couldn't stop thinking about the way his handwriting had looked in the margins, certain and unbothered, like a man who'd done far harder math than that, in far worse conditions. On impulse, half convinced she'd find nothing, she searched his name. It took 11 minutes to find what she wasn't looking for. A structural patent filed under Daniel R. Hartley, a seismic dampening system still cited in engineering journals a decade later. A firm bio, long since taken down but cached by some forgotten archive, listing him as co-founder and chief structural engineer of a firm once counted among the most respected in the mid-Atlantic. She sat back in her chair, the blue light of the screen the only light in the office. The man sanding down banisters on the platform below her building had once designed systems that kept hospitals standing during earthquakes. He hadn't mentioned it once. Not a word, not a hint, not even when 3 engineers had spent 2 days failing to solve a problem he'd fixed in 4 minutes without being asked. She didn't confront him. She didn't tell Voss. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark a long time, turning over the shape of a man who had all of that and chose, instead, sawdust and a 9-year-old's homework schedule. The next morning she found him before the crew arrived, coffee in each hand, and didn't mention what she knew. She just handed him the cup and said, "Stay for dinner tonight. The whole crew, my treat." He studied her a second too long, like he understood she was offering him something that had nothing to do with catering. "Lily will hold you to a proper dinner," he said. "Not sandwiches. I can manage a proper dinner." It was the first time either of them had smiled like they meant it, all the way through. Word traveled fast on a crew that small, and by 6 that evening the half-restored waiting hall had been dressed up as much as a construction site could manage. Long tables pushed together under exposed beams, string lights someone had rigged that afternoon, looping between iron support columns. Lily sat between her father and Evelyn without being asked to, swinging her legs under the table, peppering Evelyn with the kind of questions no adult would have dared ask. "Do you have kids?" "No." "Do you want some?" "Lily," Daniel said, low. But Evelyn shook her head, unbothered. "I used to think I didn't have time for that," Evelyn said. "Now I'm not so sure." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer, in the way only children are satisfied by half-truths delivered honestly. She went back to her mashed potatoes, already moving on to whether the old train station used to have a snack bar, and whether the ghosts that supposedly lived in the building preferred candy or vegetables. One of the younger crew members, a welder named Ortiz, who'd been working the site since the foundation repairs, leaned toward Daniel halfway through the meal and asked, not quietly enough, whether the boss lady always came to crew dinners. Daniel just shrugged and said some bosses cared about the work more than the title, and left it there, though the corner of his mouth gave away more than the answer did. Evelyn, 3 seats down, heard every word and pretended not to. Later, when the crew had thinned out and Lily had fallen asleep against her father's arm, Evelyn and Daniel sat on the loading dock steps, night settling cool over the James River a few blocks south, the city's lights smudged soft against low cloud. "Boss wants me to marry a man I've met twice," she said. She hadn't planned to tell him. It came out anyway, the way things did around him. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't offer an opinion he hadn't been asked for. "That sounds like a business decision wearing a wedding dress." "That's exactly what it is. Then it's not really a marriage." She looked at him for a long moment. He wasn't trying to rescue her from anything. He was just telling her the truth plainly, the way he'd told her about the load-bearing beam. She realized she trusted him more after 11 minutes of honesty than she trusted Bradley Kern after 2 dinners of practiced charm and a bottle of wine that cost more than her first car. "Why haven't you gone back to it?" she asked. "The engineering." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Some rooms take more out of you than they give back," he finally said. "I stopped wanting to be in them." She didn't push. She filed the answer away instead, next to the patent she'd found the night before, 2 pieces of a puzzle she hadn't earned the right to finish yet. Voss called her into his office 2 days later, the kind of summons that arrived as a calendar invite with no subject line. He didn't sit behind his desk. He stood at the window, the James River glinting behind him, and got straight to it. "Kern Development is prepared to walk if this isn't settled by month's end. Your father built this company so it would outlast him. Don't let sentiment be the reason it doesn't." "This isn't sentiment, Richard. It's my life. It's 40% of our contracts for the next decade." He turned to face her. "Your father would have signed the paperwork before I finished the sentence." "My father also built half his career on trusting people who turned out not to deserve it," she said. "I'm not sure that's the model I want to follow." Voss's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A small recalculation she didn't have time to read before she left the room. She didn't remember walking back to Main Street Station, only that she was there, standing on the mezzanine again, hands braced on the railing, breathing like she'd run the distance rather than driven it. Daniel found her there without being told where to look. He didn't ask what happened. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth off his arm, and said nothing at all. It was, she would think later, the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. The simple fact of someone standing beside her, instead of asking her to explain herself. Lily found her the next afternoon on the platform, a folded piece of paper held out with both hands, careful, like it mattered. It was a crayon drawing, a house, a dog neither of them owned, Daniel, Lily, and a woman with Evelyn's dark hair standing beside them, all holding hands under a sun with a smiling face drawn in the corner. "That's you," Lily said, matter of fact, like there was no other possible interpretation available. Evelyn's throat tightened in a way that surprised her. She folded the drawing carefully and tucked it inside her coat, close to her chest, and told herself she'd throw it away later. She never did. It stayed folded in the same coat pocket for weeks, soft at the creases from being taken out, and looked at more times than she would have admitted to anyone. Lily got a fever that Thursday, mild but stubborn, and Daniel called the site foreman to say he'd be in late, apology in his voice like taking a sick day for his daughter was something he needed to justify. Evelyn heard about it secondhand, and showed up at his apartment that evening anyway, a paper bag of soup from the place on 29th Street in one hand, feeling foolish the entire walk up the stairs. Daniel opened the door in a t-shirt with sawdust still ground into the knees of his jeans, surprise plain on his face. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She held out the bag. "I wanted to." Lily, curled on the couch under a blanket with cartoons playing low, brightened considerably at the sight of her. "Did you bring the good crackers?" "I brought soup." "I didn't know there were good crackers." "There's always good crackers," Lily said, with the weary patience of someone explaining something obvious to an adult who should know better. Evelyn ended up staying 2 hours, perched on the arm of a second-hand couch, in an apartment that smelled like cedar and old books, half watching a cartoon she couldn't have named 5 minutes later, aware the entire time of Daniel across the room, watching his daughter with an attention that had nothing performative in it at all. It was, she thought later, the most unremarkable evening she'd had in years, and also the one she thought about the most. Voss moved faster than she expected. Within days, he'd arranged for Bradley Kern to tour the Main Street station site personally. Timed, she realized too late, to coincide with the afternoon Daniel's crew was working the mezzanine. Bradley arrived in a suit too clean for a construction floor, trailing his father's assistant and a photographer for the company newsletter. He shook Evelyn's hand a beat too long and looked past Daniel entirely when Voss introduced him, addressing his first comment to Voss instead of either of them. "You've got quite the labor force here, Richard. Local hires? Daniel here is our lead craftsman," Voss said, the word landing with a flatness that made it sound smaller than it was. "Good with your hands, then," Bradley said to Daniel, not unkindly, but not kindly either, the tone of a man used to talking past people who worked with tools instead of spreadsheets. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He set down the level he'd been holding and looked Bradley in the eye. "Good with my hands, my head, and my daughter's homework. Not sure which of those you're asking about." Lily, sitting nearby, looked up sharply, and Daniel caught himself, softened, put a hand briefly on her shoulder before continuing more quietly. "This building was falling down 4 months ago. It isn't now. That's the job. That's all the job needs to be." Evelyn stepped in beside him. Close enough it wasn't accidental. "Daniel's craftsmanship is the reason this project is 3 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget, Bradley. I'd think that's worth more than a handshake." Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Bradley smiled thinly and moved on to ask about square footage and completion dates, the tour continuing as though nothing had happened at all. But something in the air had shifted, and everyone on that mezzanine felt it, the quiet, unmistakable fact that Evelyn Cross had chosen a side, in public, in front of witnesses who would remember. Later, after the tour group had gone, Lily tugged on her father's sleeve. "Was that man mean to you?" "He wasn't very kind," Daniel said, choosing his words the way he chose lumber, carefully, for the load they'd have to bear. "But being unkind doesn't make somebody right, and it doesn't make him somebody I need to worry about." "Evelyn wasn't mean," Lily said, like she was filing the observation away for later. "No," Daniel agreed, watching Evelyn's car pull out of the lot. "She wasn't." Voss didn't confront her that day. He waited until the site had cleared, then made a single phone call to a contact still working records at his old firm, asking, casually, whether anyone remembered the name Daniel Hartley. Marcus Reyes had worked security at Main Street Station since the scaffolding first went up, and before that, he'd worn a different uniform entirely. Alongside Daniel, 2 deployments and a friendship in the Army Corps of Engineers that had outlasted both of them. He'd kept that history quiet at Daniel's request, a favor he owed 100 times over for reasons neither of them talked about anymore. Voss found him anyway. He cornered him in the equipment shed one evening with an offer that sounded more like a threat dressed up as a business proposition. "I hear you two go back," Voss said. "I need to know what he's hiding. I'll make it worth your while. Nobody has to know where the information came from." Marcus didn't answer right away. He thought about the promise he'd made Daniel years ago, in a hospital hallway neither of them liked to remember, and about what silence had already cost people who deserved better than silence. 2 days later, he didn't go to Voss. He went to Evelyn, a folder under his arm, jaw set like a man crossing a line he'd rehearsed crossing for a long time and still hated crossing. "There's something you should see," he said, "about Daniel. About a building in Norfolk 9 years ago." The folder held an incident report from a partial structural failure at a public housing complex, and buried in it, Daniel Hartley's name as the engineer who'd caught the fault before it became a full collapse, who'd evacuated 400 residents on his own authority hours before the fire marshal even arrived on scene, who'd been quietly written out of the firm's official account afterward, so that the partners above him could take the credit and the blame in whatever proportions best served their own reputations. "He never talked about it," Marcus said. "Not once. Not even to me," and I asked, more than once. "He just walked away from the firm about a year later, right around the time his wife got sick. I think the two things got tangled together for him. I think he stopped trusting rooms full of people who write their own version of the truth when it's convenient for them." Evelyn sat with the folder open on her lap for a long time after Marcus left. The office quiet around her, the city outside going dark by degrees. She recognized one of the names on the old firm's letterhead, a name she'd seen before on a joint civic infrastructure committee her father had sat on the same year. a small, uncomfortable reminder of how close all these worlds sat to one another, money and buildings and the men who decided, whose names got remembered and whose got quietly erased from the record. She understood, finally, why Daniel Hartley had chosen sawdust over blueprints. It wasn't humility, it was the only kind of honesty he had left to give, after the kind he used to give had cost him everything he trusted. Marcus had told her one more thing before he left the office that evening, almost as an afterthought, standing in the doorway with his hand already on the frame. He doesn't know I kept a copy of that report all these years. I told myself it was for insurance, in case Voss's people ever tried something. Truth is, I think I always knew somebody would need to see it eventually. I just didn't expect it'd be you. He'd looked for a moment, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long time. Go easy with it. He's not going to want to be somebody's cause. She found him on the platform that evening, Lily already asleep on a folded jacket nearby, and didn't say anything about the folder at first. She just sat down beside him on the cold concrete, close, and asked, "Norfolk, 9 years ago." He went very still, his hands stopping their work entirely. "Marcus told you. He was right to." Daniel looked at his daughter, breathing slow and even a few feet away, small and unaware of everything being spoken over her sleeping form. "I saved 400 people, and the company I helped build erased me from the record, so it wouldn't look bad in the papers. Nobody in that firm ever asked if I was all right after. They asked if I'd sign the settlement quietly and go home." He exhaled, the sound heavier than the words themselves. "My wife was diagnosed 3 weeks later. I decided I was done building things for people who'd forget my name the second it stopped being convenient to remember it." "I won't forget it," Evelyn said. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, something in his face wasn't guarded at all. The careful distance he kept from almost everyone simply gone. "Why are you telling me this instead of running the other way?" he asked, not entirely a joke. "Because you didn't ask me to believe you," she said. "You just told me the truth and let me decide what to do with it. Nobody's done that for me in a long time either." He was quiet a while, looking out over the dark platform, at the shapes of half-finished archways catching moonlight through the gaps in the scaffolding. "After Norfolk, I used to think the worst part was losing my name off the record," he said. "Took me a long time to figure out the worst part was how easy it was for everyone else to let it happen. Nobody in that boardroom stood up. Not one." He glanced at her. "I keep waiting to see if this is going to go the same way." "It isn't," she said, and meant it more than she'd meant anything and longer than she wanted to admit. Voss struck 2 days later, in a room full of people, the way he always preferred to. He'd assembled an emergency board session ahead of the scheduled shareholders' vote, and he opened with Daniel's old firm records projected on the screen behind him. Framed as a liability, a risk the board hadn't vetted, it's a man with a buried history working unsupervised around the CEO and her child. "I'd ask the board to consider what it means for optics and for our contract with Kern Development that our chief executive has developed a personal entanglement with an unvetted contractor whose own former employer distanced themselves from him," Voss said, each word placed like a stone set deliberately into a wall. Daniel stood in the doorway. He hadn't been invited, but Marcus had told him what was coming, and he'd come anyway, because he wasn't going to let his name be spoken about in a room he wasn't allowed to answer in. "I wasn't distanced," Daniel said, voice level, filling the room without needing to rise at all. "I was erased. There's a difference, and Mr. Voss knows it, because it's the same trick men like him use on anyone inconvenient to remember. Ask him what happened to the 2 junior engineers who signed off on that Norfolk complex under his old firm's letterhead. Ask him where they ended up." The room went quiet. Voss's composure slipped, just barely, just enough for Evelyn to see it from across the table. One of the older board members, a woman named Priscilla Atkins, who'd served with Evelyn's father for 2 decades and rarely spoke in these sessions, cleared her throat into the silence. "I remember that Norfolk complex," she said. "My sister lived 3 buildings over. I remember there being some engineer nobody could get a straight answer about afterward. Didn't think I'd ever be sitting across a table from him." She looked at Voss, not unkindly, but without any warmth left in it either. "Richard, I think you'd better sit down." Voss didn't sit. He gathered his folder instead, movements suddenly stiff, and said something about the board reconvening once cooler heads prevailed, but nobody in the room was listening to him anymore. "I don't need you to defend me," Daniel added, looking at Evelyn now. not Voss. I just needed to say it once, out loud, in a room that couldn't erase it a second time. Lily had been waiting outside with Marcus, and when raised voices carried faintly through the door, Daniel excused himself immediately, crossing the hall to crouch beside her, block her view of the room, keep his voice soft and steady until the tightness left her small shoulders. Whatever was happening inside that room, it wasn't going to reach her, not on his watch. The vote was scheduled for the following morning. Evelyn spent the night at her desk compiling every piece of the record Marcus had recovered, cross-referenced against the Norfolk incident logs, alongside the load calculation Daniel had corrected on the mezzanine weeks earlier, proof stacked next to proof until the story told itself without her needing to raise her voice at all. She stood before the board the next morning and didn't mention marriage, didn't mention Kern development, didn't mention Bradley at all. "Richard wants you to believe our timeline is at risk because of who I choose to trust," she said, meeting each set of eyes around the table in turn. "The truth is the opposite. This project is ahead of schedule, under budget, and structurally sound because of the man he's trying to discredit. 9 years ago, that same man saved 400 lives and got written out of the story for it. My father built this company on craftsmanship, not connections bought at a wedding. I intend to keep it that way, with or without this board's blessing." The vote wasn't close. Voss resigned before the session adjourned, his letter 2 sentences long. No apology, no explanation, the kind of exit that said everything about the kind of man he'd always been underneath 30 years of careful charm. Priscilla Adkins stopped Evelyn on her way out of the boardroom, handlight on her arm. "Your father used to say the measure of a company was what it did when nobody profitable was watching," she said. "I think he'd have liked what just happened in there a great deal more than he'd have liked a wedding." Evelyn didn't trust her voice enough to answer. She just nodded and let herself be steadied by it the rest of the way down the hall. Evelyn didn't go back to her office afterward. She went straight to Main Street Station, found Daniel exactly where she knew she would, sleeves rolled, hands dusted with sawdust, and said nothing at all before crossing the platform to stand beside him. "You didn't have to come here first," he said. "I wanted to." They stood there a while, not saying much, the platform quiet around them for the first time in months, without a deadline pressing on either of them. Lily arrived 20 minutes later, dropped off by a neighbor, and ran the length of the platform when she spotted them both standing together, no longer needing to ask what it meant. The following week, a reporter from the Richmond Times-Dispatch called Daniel directly, having pieced together the Norfolk story from board meeting minutes that had somehow found their way into public record. He turned down the interview twice before Evelyn convinced him a short, plain statement might do more good than silence ever had. "I'm not interested in being anybody's redemption story," he told her, standing in the unfinished kitchen of the apartment he still hadn't found time to fix up. "You don't have to be anybody's story," she said. "You could just tell the truth once, on your own terms, and then be done with it." He thought about that for 2 days before he called the reporter back. The piece ran a week later, 4 paragraphs, factual, unembellished. Daniel's own words doing most of the work. He didn't read the comments. Evelyn read every one of them and didn't tell him how many people had written in to say they remembered him from Norfolk, remembered a stranger banging on doors at 2 in the morning, telling them to get out now, not later. Now, the weeks after moved quieter than any of the ones before them. Voss's departure left no scandal behind, no headlines, just an empty chair at the next board meeting, and a company that ran, if anything, more steadily without him in it. Bradley Kern's father found another firm to court within the month, and nobody at Cross and Wren mourned the loss of that contract for even a day. Daniel and Evelyn found their evenings drifting toward each other, without either of them naming it out loud. She started staying past the site's closing hour, ostensibly for inspections that grew shorter and shorter each time. He started keeping 2 cups of coffee warm instead of 1, without being asked. Lily stopped being surprised to find Evelyn there and started, instead, simply assuming she would be, the way children assume the people who matter most will keep showing up. One evening in early spring, the last of the scaffolding finally came down from the station's east wing, and Daniel and Evelyn climbed the newly finished stairwell to the rooftop terrace together, the city spread out below them, the James River catching the last gold light of the day. "It's almost finished," she said. "Almost." He looked at her, not at the building. "What happens after that?" She didn't answer right away. She reached over instead, and for the first time, let her hand rest against his on the railing. Neither of them pulled away, and neither of them said anything for a long while, the silence between them entirely different from every silence that had come before it. "I used to think I wanted my old life back," Daniel said finally. "The firm, the title, all of it. Standing up there tonight, saying it out loud, I kept waiting to feel like I'd gotten something back." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't feel that. I felt like I'd finally set something down." "What do you feel now?" she asked. He looked at her. Not the skyline, not the river, just her. "Like maybe I'm not finished building things after all. Just different things than I thought." Somewhere below, a train sounded its horn, the first passenger service through the station since restoration began, a low note rolling out over the rooftops of Shockoe Bottom and fading into the evening. Below them, Lily sat on the loading dock steps with Marcus, swinging her legs, watching the two shapes on the rooftop without needing anyone to explain what she was looking at. She'd known for weeks. Grown-ups, she'd decided privately, were slow about the things kids figured out immediately. "Took him long enough," she said to Marcus, with the flat disappointment of someone who'd been managing expectations for months. Marcus laughed, low, and didn't argue with her. "Some things are worth doing slow, kiddo. Your dad's just careful with what matters." "I know," Lily said, softening. "That's kind of the whole point of him." The grand opening of the new Cross and Wren headquarters filled the restored waiting hall 3 months later. String lights replaced now with real fixtures, the old ticket windows kept exposed, just as Daniel had first suggested, brick and iron standing the way they had a century earlier, only steadier now, only more certain of what they were built to hold. Reporters wandered the platform with notepads and cameras. Board members mingled with client after client under light that fell soft through restored skylights. Lily wove through the crowd in a dress she'd picked out herself, introducing Evelyn to her teacher, to the mailman she recognized from the neighborhood, to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. "This is my dad's friend," she said each time, and then, almost every time, added, quieter, like a secret she was proud to be trusted with. "She's the best one." Marcus caught Daniel near the bar table, 2 glasses of sparkling cider in hand, since neither of them had ever cared much for anything stronger. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Marcus said, nodding toward the crowd, the cameras, the whole polished evening. "Standing in a room like this again." "Different room," Daniel said. "Different reasons for being in it. You did good with this place." Marcus looked up at the restored ceiling, the old rosettes Daniel had spent 3 weeks repairing by hand. "Your wife would have liked it. All of it, probably, not just the building." Daniel didn't answer right away, but something eased in his shoulders, an old weight shifting to make room for something new instead of simply replacing it. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think she would have." Priscilla Adkins found Evelyn near the ticket windows shortly after, offering a rare smile. "Your father would be proud of this building," she said, "but I suspect he'd be prouder of what you did to earn it honestly." She glanced toward Daniel and Lily across the room, not unkindly. "Don't let this next part scare you the way the company did. Some things are worth being brave about twice in one lifetime." Daniel found Evelyn near the old ticket windows toward the end of the evening, the crowd thinning, the noise settling into something softer, the last of the light fading over the river outside. "You said something to me once," he said. "The first day, before any of this. You said you wished you had a family like mine. I remember. I told you my kid needs a mom." He paused, turning the cup in his hands. "I wasn't joking, not entirely. I just didn't expect an answer." Evelyn looked past him, at Lily laughing with Marcus near the door, at the building they'd both rebuilt from the ground up, at the man standing in front of her, who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was, patent or no patent, company or no company. "You have one now," she said, "if you'll have her." He didn't answer with words. He reached for her hand, the way he had on the rooftop, certain this time, and neither of them looked toward the door, or the crowd, or anything at all beyond each other, and the building standing quiet and whole around them. Neither of them had been looking.